Humanity does not live in one single world, but in millions, even hundreds of billions of worlds. Each world has its own historical evolution and its own destined trajectory. The job of the Space-Time Bureau is to observe the evolutionary development of the worlds and ensure their stability. 100 years ago, I delivered my introduction speech in the hall of the Space-Time Bureau. At that time, I was still passionate about my promising future as a time observer. Nevertheless, the man behind the long table quietly listened to my entire speech with a disinterested expression, then directed his gaze at Zero, who was standing behind me.
From now on, don't bother me with welcoming new members.
You have taken on the responsibility of leading the Space-Time Bureau.
Zero shrugged and then smiled.
This was our agreement.
The man across the table frowned and turned to me again.
Why do you want to become a time observer?
Because this is the future I saw. I paused for a moment, then answered truthfully.
Sounds like you're perfect for the job.
What makes you say that? Instead of a reply, the man eyed me apathetically and spoke with an emotionless tone.
Welcome to the Space-Time Bureau.
Yet, there wasn't the slightest hint of welcome in his expression. The situation didn't seem to take Zero by surprise, but it left me at my wit's end. He ushered me out of the room and showed me around, while explaining my duties as a time observer.
I believe you're aware that the Space-Time Bureau is an observation institute independent of all powers. Our mission is to ensure that each space-time unit follows its destined course, so as not to cause an imbalance in the universe.
I nodded in response. My greatest pride in life was being one of the very few time evolvers who succeeded in becoming a time observer. After all, the war from a decade ago turned the world I was from into complete chaos, and my whole family died in the upheaval. I once desperately traveled to different timelines with the hope of altering the future, but only after learning about the time observers did I realize that the future cannot be changed, no matter how many pasts and futures I had seen. Each individual was nothing more than a screw that kept the world on track, which would be tightened as soon as it came loose. Eventually, I ended up here, escaping the fate of being merely a cog in this gigantic machine. But when I looked up at the vast and boundless universe, the feeling of being insignificant remained. Eternity is the only eternal truth. This was my only consolation. Zero stopped in his tracks and shot me a glance.
You're too young to understand the pain of eternity.
Eternity means eternal solitude. It took me a long, long time to finally understand this. That was another 100 years later. On the observatory, the planets continued in orbit as usual. Day after day, I recorded the data from my observations, calculating the possible branches on each timeline and their impact on the future. Amid such tedious tasks, I almost forgot how slow time passed and how long a century was. That man named Victor would come here occasionally. When he saw me, he would only greet me with a slight nod, and then quietly stare at the planets in the observatory. I noticed that his gaze was only ever fixed on one object. As he visited more often, I gradually figured out what that object was: his homeworld. That world was full of extreme weather and frequent natural disasters, leaving mankind suffering in agony. But that was merely the beginning. From studying the old observation data, I was surprised to find that this world should have disappeared before I arrived here, and yet it persevered in this peculiar way. A subtle noise slipped past my ears. On the screen in the observatory was another falling planet. This represented another possibility, coming to an irreversible end. I couldn't help feeling sympathy for the man standing in silence before me. But it didn't matter. Nothing exhausted patience more than time. After the next decade, century, millennium had passed, he would then realize that world was only one of our many objects under observation. In the infinity of time, the only thing we couldn't do was change the past, which didn't belong to us. Sometime after, I was sent on an observation mission to my homeworld. Decades ago in the current timeline, an unexpected change had occurred. Although its impact was negligible, we decided to go back to that point in time and make corrections to ensure that the future was on the right course. beams of light overwhelmed my vision. As my eyesight gradually returned, familiar streets and buildings came into focus. This was where I grew up. A flock of pigeons suddenly took off from the vine-covered dome. Amid the flapping of wings, I stepped out onto the quiet streets at night, and to my surprise, felt a tinge of nostalgia. This place was no different from how I remembered it, yet it wouldn't be long before a brutal war obliterated the civilization. I located the target building in no time. I walked up the stairs, snuck into the study, and took a letter on the table with its ink still wet. Everything was according to plan. When the house owner returned, they might think the letter was blown away or thrown out by mistake. But it wouldn't cross anyone's minds that this tiniest change would alter the fate of the world. I thought mindlessly on the way back. Everything would have been different if he'd returned even a minute earlier. Spectacular shooting stars left traces of light, illuminating the night sky above. At that moment in time, my family was gathering on the beach dozens of kilometers away, awaiting the meteor shower with excitement. Of course, they would all die in an inevitable disaster in a few years. Inevitable. An unusual thought suddenly popped into my mind. If I tried again, if I went back in time, then the disaster that changed my life might not have happened. The idea frightened me. All the nerves in my body throbbed with anxiety and excitement. That accurately calculated change with minimal error had been deeply planted in my mind. The mission was complete. All I needed to do was to turn the clock hand back by one tick to make the slightest unnoticeable change to my past. At that moment, full of hope and the courage to move forward, I traveled across the timeline again without hesitation. A dazzling white glow engulfed me and permeated the boundless space. Suddenly, a powerful vortex pulled me in. When I regained consciousness, I found myself lying on the floor of the observatory. A faint stabbing pain shot through my body. I slowly opened my eyes, only to find myself lying in front of that man named Victor. The exhilaration from surviving surged to my heart. Only after I stood up with great effort did I realize what had happened. I had violated the rules and traveled across timelines without authorization, which dragged me into the rift between timelines. Without a shred of doubt, Victor had saved me.
I thought it's in you time observers' natures to follow the rules.
He spoke in a cold voice as he eyed me, brows furrowed. Thanks for saving me. I looked down to avoid his scrutinizing gaze. The mission has been completed, but there was a mishap on my way back. I never mentioned my selfish plan. The horror of being engulfed and torn apart had scarred me, and I secretly warned myself never to take risks ever again.
Saving my subordinates is one of my responsibilities. I'm not interested in your unauthorized actions. I only have one piece of advice for you. Don't do anything beyond your ability.
He easily saw through my lie. His unconcerned expression made me feel a pang of shame and even anger. Don't you think about doing the same thing? You just haven't acted on it yet. I just want to give you a friendly reminder. It's all pointless.
You and Zero think exactly the same.
I didn't understand what he meant, but he clearly didn't want to explain any further, and walked straight toward the door. You'll never change the ending no matter how many times you try. What's the point? My voice raised uncontrollably, and he calmly turned to look at me.
Why would you ask me that?
I froze in shock. It wasn't until a rustling sound broke the deadlocked silence that I pulled myself back to reality. I didn't know if it was a question for him or myself. Another planet was slowly falling in the observatory, and we both knew very well what it meant. He didn't speak again. His gaze was fixated on the fading trail and did not shift even for a second. The days in the Space-Time Bureau carried on as usual. Perhaps it was because of him that I began to pay more attention to his homeworld. But no matter how much time had passed, the curve symbolizing that world's life remained in the shade, and its outline only ever grew dimmer and less defined. What else would that world suffer through? Earthquakes? Tsunamis? War? None of these would be surprising. However many possibilities there are, they would only lead to the same ending. I didn't understand why he chose to go back. The moment he returned to that world, his fate was at stake. I rubbed my temples as I recorded my observations for the day. A gleam of light quietly grew in the observatory, like millions of streams slowly penetrating and surrounding that planet. As soon as I noticed the anomaly, I quickly realized something and rushed to his office. I was just observing your homeworld and noticed an anomaly that's never happened before. I was always particularly nervous whenever I stood before him. Let me give you an analogy. It's like an avenue splitting into tiny paths. Of course, it's very likely that the paths are just dead ends, or they could soon merge into its original orbit. Wait, where are you going? A long time ago, Loveland City had become an island isolated from the outside world, a place where even time observers could not travel in and out freely, except for Victor. Zero was not able to interfere with the anomalies in this timeline. All he could do was to warn Victor again and again that if he disregarded the trajectory of the worlds, then he was bound to pay the price. From then on, every time he used his power, he caused massive damage to himself and the time he had left. The most severe case was when he stopped time to block the bullet that was supposed to take the girl's life, but this action backfired disastrously on himself. However, Victor clearly did not care about the price. Or perhaps he was more concerned about preventing the girl's death in the unpredictable future.
Have you ever thought that the chance you're looking for is dependent upon certainty? At least you can recover your powers in the Space-Time Bureau. You know this better than I do.
How long will I have to stay?
On the timescale of the Space-Time Bureau, 10,000 years. But don't worry, even if you intend to return to that world afterward, only a month will have passed there. But you can keep searching for the ending if you stay. Someone standing on the bank can see the direction of the river more easily than the fish in the water, right?
This time, he accepted Zero's invitation. After all this time, this observed anomaly may have been the possibility he had been looking for all along. Collapsing one after another, fragments of time and space fell from him in an attempt to drive away this intruder. He almost couldn't breathe. The air around him seemed to be sucked away, and the tremendous pressure of gravity crushed his body. Shattered images flashed past his eyes like streams of light. The sinking ground and the flooded city. The unchangeable future and the past he witnessed countless times appeared before him with each step forward. His Adam's apple slid up and down. Victor remained silent for a long time while his gaze fell on the flashing images. He saw the girl leaning on his shoulder, fast asleep, the blanket slowly slipping off her shoulders, and the snow sprinkling the earth silently outside the window. He saw himself, the dagger in his shaking hand plunging into the girl's body. All of the happiness and pain were real, including every death that remained vivid in his mind. But there was the faintest glow in this unfathomable space that compelled him to move forward. It was the reason why he came here. His pupils gradually dilated and flashed with a hint of disbelief and exhilaration. It was an image he had never seen before. The increasingly dense meteor cluster gathered at one point like millions of white flames. Among the countless expanding nebulas was a growing beam of light, illuminating the boundless universe and shrouding the increasingly dim blue planet. The snow-white crown slowly descended on the girl's head. That delicate silhouette almost faded in the white glow. Victor opened his mouth to shout out her name, but couldn't make a sound. He raised his hand to touch her figure, which would only slip through his fingers like quicksand, no matter how many times he tried. The shadow of the pendulum above fell behind him, with only the faintest of starlight illuminating the ground. In the silent time corridor, only the sky, the night, and the shadow of the swaying pendulum remained.
It's okay.
After a long time, he slowly retracted his hand and whispered,
We'll meet again. I won't leave you alone. Never.
Ever since that day, there hadn't been any more abnormal observations. I began to wonder if perhaps it had been an illusion, and even slightly regretted telling Victor.
I thought he would change his mind after he came here.
After learning what happened, Zero gazed at the closed time gate and let out a deep sigh.
He was the only person with whom I couldn't verify the certainty of time.
For some reason, I thought of myself at that moment. I was eager to go back in time when given the opportunity. But I didn't have the strong power he had, nor did I have the courage to face failure and despair over and over again. We all knew he would be back, but we weren't sure if he would return empty-handed. Maybe he did see something different on the path, but no matter how divergent the path was, it was already destined for doom and destruction. The light of dawn followed the laws of the universe, slowly crossing the horizon and rising from the edge of the earth like a floating mist. I couldn't resist reaching out my hand to touch the floor-to-ceiling window behind me. I wanted to know if I could actually feel those warm, distant particles from here, and if that warmth was so attractive that he was willing to walk alone and spend the rest of eternity searching for that slim possibility. Slow, heavy footsteps echoed in the darkness. Zero had been waiting for a long time in front of the time gate.
You're back.
Zero quietly looked at the exhausted man before him.
It seems you found the ending you've been searching for. But I must remind you, the unknown and unexpected are more terrifying than the visible future.
And only the unknown and the unexpected can bring hope.
But why did you choose this path? It's far too narrow, even if it's not a dead end. So narrow, in fact, that only one person can get through.
You're right. Your observations have always been correct. But you're wrong about one thing. The person who can save that world isn't me. It's her. And as for me,
His voice was calm, and without the slightest hesitation.
no one knows my limits or how much pain I can endure better than I do. I'd rather take this risk.
Zero stared at him without a word for a long time, and finally let out a heavy sigh.
It's time. I still hope you'll stay, or at least come back one day.
Victor remained silent, gazing down at the pocket watch in his hand. The minute hand was moving counterclockwise, closing in on the number 12. He had been waiting here for way too long. The clock chimed, and the time gate was pulled open by the countless wheels and clock hands. Under the flickering starlight, Victor turned and walked through the pitch-black walkway without hesitation. His heavy cloak shook off countless bits of stardust that had accumulated over time and disappeared behind the closing gate. In the silence, Zero turned around and stared at the currents rippling through the air. The man's last words continued to echo in his ears.
Besides, it's precisely the hope of seeing that world again that made me believe the best path is inevitably the toughest.